There is an internal voice that rarely raises its volume, yet never truly goes silent. It doesn't insult, it doesn't shout, it evaluates. Every action is reviewed, every pause is questioned, every result is measured against what could have been done better. Even when things go well, something inside quietly asks if it was enough. People who are excessively self-demanding often don't experience this as pressure. They experience it as responsibility, as awareness, as wanting to do things right. The standard isn't perfection in the dramatic sense, it's constant improvement. Rest feels temporary, satisfaction feels provisional. There is always a next adjustment waiting. In daily life, this shows up subtly. Achievements are acknowledged briefly, then dismissed. Mistakes linger longer than successes. Free time is enjoyed with a background sense of obligation. Even moments of calm carry a low-grade tension, as if something important is being neglected. Because this self-pressure doesn't always produce visible distress, it's often praised. Discipline, commitment, high standards. From the outside, it looks like strength. From the inside, it feels like never fully arriving. The mind stays oriented toward what's missing, what's unfinished, what could still be improved. And beneath that steady internal push, a quiet question begins to form. Not, why am I so hard on myself, but what happens if I ever stop demanding more? This constant self-demand rarely appears without a history. In many cases, it develops early as a way to stay safe, valued, or in control. Doing well becomes more than a goal, it becomes a condition. Approval may have been subtle, inconsistent, or tied to performance. Over time, the mind learns to apply pressure internally before it ever comes from outside. From a psychological perspective, excessive self-demand functions as regulation. If standards stay high, mistakes feel preventable. If effort never drops, disappointment can be anticipated. The inner pressure isn't meant to punish, it's meant to protect. It keeps the person alert, prepared, and ahead of potential failure. Behaviorally, this shows up as over-responsibility, taking on more than necessary, replaying conversations to check for errors, preparing excessively for simple tasks. The person isn't anxious about doing poorly, they are vigilant about not slipping. Even small imperfections feel loaded, as if they signal something larger. Over time, this creates a narrow internal margin. There is little room for uncertainty, rest, or gradual progress. Everything feels slightly urgent. Even neutral moments carry evaluation. The system stays active not because something is wrong, but because stopping feels risky. And slowly, the pressure becomes self-sustaining. High standards no longer respond to real demands. They respond to an internal rule that says, relaxing is only allowed after everything is done.
There is a point where this internal pressure stops feeling like motivation and starts feeling like weight. It often appears in moments that should feel complete. A task is finished, a goal is reached, a responsibility is handled. Externally, the situation resolves. Internally, nothing settles. The mind immediately moves to what's next, what's missing, what could still be improved. From a behavioral perspective, this happens because self-demand shifts the reference point. Success is no longer an endpoint, it's a checkpoint. The system doesn't register completion, it registers exposure. Finishing something means it can now be evaluated, compared, judged. So the mind moves forward quickly, avoiding the vulnerability of staying with the result. Psychologically, this creates a chronic state of incompletion. The person is always in motion internally, even when nothing is required. Satisfaction feels unsafe, as if pausing would invite complacency or decline. The inner standard keeps advancing, ensuring there is always pressure to respond to. Over time, this produces a specific kind of fatigue, not burnout, not collapse, but a steady erosion. The person functions, performs, delivers, yet the sense of arrival never comes. Everything is done under the condition that it still isn't quite enough. This is often when the experience becomes confusing. Effort is high, results exist, yet relief remains absent, and the quiet realization begins to surface. The pressure isn't coming from the situation anymore, it's coming from within. As this pattern continues, it begins to shape the relationship with rest and self-worth. Downtime feels conditional. Breaks are allowed only when they are justified by effort. Even then, relaxation is monitored. The mind checks whether rest is deserved, productive, or strategically timed. Calm is permitted, but never fully trusted. From a psychological perspective, excessive self-demand fuses value with output. Worth becomes something to be maintained through performance rather than something assumed. When activity slows, the internal system looks for proof that nothing is being lost. Rest stops feeling restorative and starts feeling risky, like letting go of a position that must be defended. Emotionally, this creates a narrow emotional range. Pride is brief, relief is shallow, guilt appears easily. The person may appear composed and capable, yet internally there is constant negotiation. Have I done enough to earn this moment? Pleasure is enjoyed with restraint, as if it might interfere with responsibility. Nothing dramatic collapses, life continues, goals are met, but the internal cost accumulates quietly. Energy is spent maintaining standards rather than being renewed. Over time, the person may feel inexplicably tired, even when doing everything right. The pressure that once created momentum now maintains tension.
And beneath that tension, a quieter question starts to emerge. Not how can I do better, but what part of me only feels acceptable when I'm pushing? Over time, this self-imposed pressure begins to shape identity. The person may start to see themselves as disciplined, demanding, or high-functioning. These labels feel accurate. They explain the drive, they justify the standards, and they turn constant effort into a personality trait rather than a coping pattern. Psychologically, identity formed around self-demand creates a fragile balance. The person feels stable as long as performance remains high, but when energy dips, motivation fades, or mistakes appear, the internal foundation shakes. Worth feels temporarily threatened, even if nothing external changes. The pressure must continue, not because the world demands it, but because the self has been built around it. Behaviorally, this leads to chronic self-monitoring. Progress is measured constantly. Internal language stays corrective. The person pushes even when tired, not out of ambition, but out of obligation. Slowing down feels like falling behind, even when there is no race. Over time, this narrows self-acceptance. Parts of the self that rest, hesitate, or need support are seen as liabilities. Only the driven, capable version feels safe to inhabit. And quietly, the system becomes dependent on pressure to maintain a sense of legitimacy. The question that begins to surface isn't about achievement anymore. It's about permission. Who am I allowed to be when I'm not demanding more from myself? The most important shift begins when excessive self-demand is no longer seen as character, but as conditioning. Not proof of strength, but evidence of a system that learned to equate pressure with safety. At some point, pushing became the way to stay ahead of disappointment, criticism, or loss of control. The habit stayed, even when the threat faded. When this is recognized, the pressure doesn't disappear instantly, but it becomes visible, and visibility changes the relationship. Self-demand stops being unquestioned truth and becomes a pattern that can be observed. The inner voice is still there, but it's no longer the only authority. Psychologically, easing pressure doesn't mean lowering standards. It means separating worth from output, allowing effort to exist without constant evaluation, letting completion be completion, not a prelude to more demand. This can feel unsettling at first. Without pressure, the system doesn't know what holds things together. But over time, something else emerges. Stability without force, motivation that isn't fueled by fear of falling short, rest that actually restores. The drive doesn't vanish, it becomes optional rather than compulsory. It may be worth noticing when the internal push appears most strongly, what it's trying to prevent, what it believes would happen if it stopped. In many cases, excessive self-demand isn't about wanting more. It's about being afraid that without pressure, everything would fall apart. Here, these patterns are observed calmly.